What happens when the victim becomes the judge? A black woman, once wronged by racist cops, now holds the gavel over their case. How will the officers react when they realize the justice they once ignored is now in their hands? Watch the powerful twist unfold. It was a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado, when Camille, a well-respected black attorney, sat on a park bench reading a book. The peaceful scene quickly turned chaotic when a police cruiser pulled up. Two officers stepped out, immediately locking eyes with Camille, the only person nearby. "Mom, may we speak with you for a moment?" One officer called out, his voice carrying suspicion rather than concern. Camille looked up, unfazed. "Of course," she replied, closing her book. The second officer approached with a clipped tone. "We got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" "Sitting here reading," Camille answered, holding up her book. But their scrutiny didn't stop. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" Camille asked, her patience waning. "It's routine," the second officer replied, though his tone implied otherwise. Camille reached into her bag, handing over her ID. The officer scanned it with unnecessary intensity. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud mockingly. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" "I live here. I came to the park to enjoy a peaceful moment." "Is that a problem?" Camille said, remaining calm. The officers exchanged looks. "We'll see." They handed back her ID, but their questioning continued. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" One sneered. "Are you alone or waiting for someone?" The other added, his hand resting on his belt. Camille had dealt with tense situations in courtrooms before, but this felt different. The power imbalance was stark, and their tone felt threatening. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. The first officer's patience wore thin. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille replied, standing her ground. "I'm not breaking any laws by sitting in a public park." But reason didn't seem to matter. The first officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, though Camille hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed. The crowd around them began murmuring, some pulling out their phones to record. "Stop resisting," the officer yelled despite Camille's compliance. Camille felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. Her heart raced with humiliation and frustration as the officers led her to their cruiser. One of the onlookers locked eyes with her, silently documenting the injustice unfolding. As the door slammed shut, Camille knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. In the back of the police car, Camille's mind raced. She had spent years defending clients, standing up for justice, and navigating the legal system. But now she was on the other side. She stared out the window, her reflection merging with the passing scenery. The absurdity of the situation was suffocating, but there was no humor, only anger. At the station, the process was humiliating. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a small holding cell where the fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly. "Enjoy your stay," one officer sneered as he shut the cell door. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her. A young officer approached, clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said flatly. "On what grounds?" Camille asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied, turning to leave. Camille exhaled, thinking strategically. She knew the charges were flimsy, but the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. Eventually, she was released on bail. As she stepped into the cool night air, the contrast from the suffocating station was a sharp relief. She spotted her colleague, Marissa, waiting by the curb. Camille and Marissa rushed over, her face a mix of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Camille nodded, though her body betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, Marissa kept glancing at her. Finally, Camille broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Camille replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open books. She worked relentlessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers. Her hands shook, not from fear but from determination. As days passed, the community rallied around her. The video of her arrest had gone viral, and people from all walks of life reached out in support. Camille wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed. Her law firm was initially hesitant, but Camille stood firm. This fight isn't just about me, it's about setting a precedent, she said. The viral video had sparked nationwide conversations. While reporters called Camille ignored them, her focus was clear, holding the officers accountable and exposing systemic flaws. At night, the weight of the situation crept in. She replayed the arrest in her mind, the dismissive tone, the handcuffs, but it fueled her determination. One evening, Marissa stopped by with takeout. Camille barely looked up as Marissa set the food on the table. "You've been at this for hours," Marissa said gently. "I don't have a choice," Camille replied, never missing a beat. Marissa studied her face. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." "I know," Camille said, her voice steady. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She combed through similar cases, gathering evidence to dismantle the officers' claims. But it wasn't just about the courtroom. Camille also made it a point to engage with the community, attending town halls, listening to others' stench of injustice, and speaking at local colleges about accountability. One afternoon, while walking to her car, a stranger approached her. "Miss Johnson," the woman asked hesitantly. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice cracking, "for standing up to them, for standing up for all of us." Camille felt her throat tighten. "I'm just doing what I can." The community support empowered her, but also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then, one day, her attorney called. The officer she was suing had filed a motion to dismiss the case. Camille expected it, but what came next shocked her. "Camille," he said cautiously, "you've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. Camille had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers, and now fate had handed her an unexpected opportunity for justice. Could she remain impartial? She thought about the people depending on her to make a stand. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a chance to show what real justice looked like. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people filed in. The case seemed ordinary, an internal misconduct hearing involving 2 officers accused of excessive force. To most, it was just another day in the justice system. Carter and Daniels, the officers, sat at the defendant's table indifferent. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell silent. Camille stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her expression calm yet commanding. As she took her seat, she glanced toward the defendants. Officer Carter's face drained of color. His eyes widened in shock. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process what he was seeing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested at the park. Camille allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began the proceedings. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure faltering. Carter whispered something to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his focus on Camille. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt the upper hand. But she knew this wasn't about revenge. Her job as a judge demanded impartiality, and she would uphold that standard. Still, the irony wasn't lost on her or anyone else in the room. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Camille maintained her professionalism, listening intently and taking notes. But every so often, her gaze would flicker toward the officers. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands fidgeted slightly. During a recess, Carter and Daniel stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed, his frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup." Their lawyer interjected, "It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But the officers weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Camille remained composed, ensuring the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. Yet, her presence alone seemed to unsettle the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence eroding little by little. At one point during witness testimony, Camille caught Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiance, it was something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Camille adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced as the room emptied. Camille lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. But for Camille, the real challenge wasn't in the irony of the moment, it was in the decisions that would follow and whether justice could truly prevail. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd than usual for a misconduct hearing. Some were there out of curiosity, others to support Camille. Though they knew her role as the judge meant she couldn't show favoritism, Camille entered with the same calm, composed demeanor, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into the arguments. The prosecutor methodically laid out evidence against the officers, presenting testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment, they were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." Camille nodded, taking in every word. Her pen glided across her notepad, her focus unshakable, even as the defendant shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The defense attorney rose to counter. His tone was measured but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the arguments continued, Camille couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience. The excuses, the justifications, it was all too familiar. Yet she pushed her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her. When it was time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room deepened. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Ethan. His voice trembled as he recounted the night he was tackled to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Ethan said, his eyes darting nervously between the attorneys and the officers. "It felt like they decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." The prosecutor pressed further. "And did you resist their orders at any point?" "No," Ethan replied firmly. "I was scared, but I did everything they said. It didn't matter. They had already made up their minds." The room was silent. As the defense attorney stood to cross-examine, he tried to poke holes in Ethan's testimony, but the young man held his ground. Camille watched intently, her expression unreadable. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first to take the stand. He glanced nervously at Camille as he swore the oath, his voice shaky as he answered the prosecutor's questions. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, "you've been accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Carter hesitated, his gaze darting toward Daniels before answering. "I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call. And do you believe your actions were justified?" The prosecutor pressed. "At the time, yes. But looking back, I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor pressed on. "Handled it differently how?" "By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground." Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, his demeanor was similarly strained. His attempts to justify his actions only deepened the prosecutor's case, highlighting the officer's inability to take accountability. Camille listened closely, her face betraying no emotion, but inside she felt a mixture of frustration and pity. These men had been given authority, yet they wielded it recklessly, leaving a trail of harm in their wake. As the day wore on, it became clear that the evidence against the officers was overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was powerful, urging the court to set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. When the defense delivered its closing statement, it was clear they were grasping at straws. Their arguments lacked conviction, and even the officers seemed resigned to the likely outcome. Camille adjourned the hearing, her voice steady as she announced that a ruling would be delivered the following week. As the courtroom emptied, Carter and Daniels lingered near the exit, their faces pale and drawn. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the gravity of their actions and the reality of what awaited them. But justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability, change, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. A week later, the courtroom was silent as Camille entered to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, the tension almost tangible. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised to capture every word. This was no longer just a case about two officers, it had become a symbol of a larger fight for justice and accountability. Camille's voice was calm but firm as she began. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. Carter and Daniel sat at the defense table, their heads bowed. The weight of her words was unmistakable. The evidence presented has demonstrated that officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified but indicative of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. Camille outlined the consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in extensive retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would follow them. The ruling was firm but fair, striking a balance between accountability and the opportunity for reform. When she finished, Camille closed the case with a decisive gavel strike. This court is adjourned. The officers stood, their expressions somber as they prepared to leave. Before exiting, Carter hesitated and turned to Camille. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was a start." Camille nodded, acknowledging his words without offering absolution. True change, she knew, would come through actions, not apologies. As the courtroom emptied, Camille remained seated, taking a moment to reflect. She had seen justice served, but the victory felt bittersweet. For every case like this, countless others went unspoken, unresolved. Later that evening, Camille attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories, their frustrations, their hopes. As she listened, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One older woman approached her after the meeting, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she said, gripping Camille's hand tightly. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Camille smiled softly. "This is just the beginning. We have so much more work to do." The following week, community leaders, law enforcement, and activists came together to discuss reforms, with Camille using her platform to advocate for transparency and accountability in policing. The case sparked a statewide movement, with people pushing for fairness and equality. For Camille, it wasn't about personal vindication, but preventing others from enduring similar hardships. Though the fight for justice was ongoing, watching young activists rally gave her hope, reminding her that change was possible. If you believe in accountability and progress, subscribe for more inspiring stories to help create a fairer world.